Hello, everyone. Hello, Sat. I'd like to welcome everyone at our second panel of Disruption Forum, Engineering Horizons. My name is Pavel Averin, and I'm the Operations Director at Netguru. And today we have a great guest, Ranjeev, which is the CTO of Solaris. And we'll have the exciting topic. We'll talk about their regulations and compliance and so on. But first, Sat, let's start with yourself. I would like to know you better. Tell us a little bit about you, about your experience.
Hi, Pavel. Lovely to be here, right? And it's interesting that we are talking a lot about a lot of modern technologies, and I'm coming and talking about regulations, right? But I've been a software engineer for most of my life, right? I've built handwriting recognition systems. I've built ledger systems, and maybe that's where I'm mostly familiar with, right? ERP systems, things like that. I started as most graybeards would, start coding when we are really young, right? I started with something called Logo, which is a small programming language which you can draw things in the computers late in the 80s, right? Been a person, tweaking with code for a very long time. Breaking things as always, right? And finally got into a place where breaking things can be maybe a little bit more tricky.
Exactly. And where are you now? So I can imagine that now breaking things is more dangerous than before at your current
No,
position, right?
indeed, and maybe indeed, right? Let me give a bit of an introduction to the rest, right? So I work in a bank. We are called Solaris. We are basically a B2B bank where we provide an API to our customers. So if at all you need some sort of financial services, we provide the APIs, and our customers or our customers basically then build applications on top of it. So we are a fully regulated German bank. We're based off in Berlin. So I think Germany is one of the most regulated countries in Europe, and all of the regulations is quite challenging. And this has been a journey for myself as well, right? Like I come from a very typical software engineering background, and coming into a more regulated environment, understanding all of the bits of like not breaking things as often, right? But yet, how do you release it often, right? Like how do you release software with the DORA metrics? How do you constantly deploy multiple times yet without breaking? And that's been an interesting journey.
Exactly. So let's start and dig deeper into this. So their regulations landscape is always changing. We have the new rules. We have the new that like changes in their in the current legal requirements and so on. So how do you discover those changes? How do you discover those aspects of the regulations and then work with them?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you go into very traditional banks, this is probably a routine in companies, right? But from a technological company, this would be quite different, right? Usually, there's a regulatory monitoring team, right, which basically uses some tools to monitor what are the regulations that's there in a particular area. Like for us it's banking, so within the banking realm, what are all of the regulations, right? So and you have more you have tools around which basically does this scanning around, but this doesn't give you the full picture, right? So you'll be able to say, okay, yeah, there's a new regulation that's popping up. For example, if it was NIS2 or DORA, which is the Digital Operational Resilience Act in Europe, right? So something popping up, then this team basically would do this scanning initially, bring it to you saying that, hey, you know what, there is some regulation which might be related to IT or cybersecurity, something like that. And then basically then you have the step of taking it. You basically start breaking it down and seeing if it is if it is relevant or not. So it starts again with some sort of a regulatory monitoring setup. You could purchase tools. You could also, there are different sites which basically gives you that. So some place where you can offload it, because you don't know, you as, let's call it, tech or engineering, you don't want to necessarily do that. You want to outsource that off, right? But then you get this where you get the initial, let's say, a few set of regulations that comes over to you. Now, here's the interesting bit, right? Like, because not every regulation that comes along is going to be relevant for particular function, right? So you do need to do some sort of a, review of it to understand. And it's at the end of the day, you need to read the regulation, right? You need to read the documentation. I always think about regulations with the in the engineering or in the technology world, we have RFCs. So the IEEE basically has this RFCs, right? Like, so if you were building an email server, right? Like you're building the simple mail transfer protocol, there is an RFC for that, right? There's an RFC for IMAP. All of these are RFCs, and you're trying to implement those specifications, right? And so if you need to implement those specifications, what do you need to do? You need to actually read it, right? So you have to do the hard work, right? Somebody, maybe not you individually, but somebody has to do the hard work of actually reading the regulation to see, the first step is basically, gauging it. Does it make sense? Is it relevant? And, that would be the part where you are basically observing whether all of the regulations keeping up this and trying to see if it actually fits into your domain.
Exactly. But what's interesting is, how to do this efficiently. Because, for example, if you could invest lots of time in going through all of the regulations and basically, making sure that you like check all of the boxes, but then you're like, you lose the speed, and you haven't delivered the value for the product and for the company. So that's the hard question: how to check the boxes but deliver the value.
That's a very good question, right? Because there are multiple regulations, right? Like, for example, if in our bank itself we have the DORA regulations, we also need to follow the ISO 27001 for certification. There's PCI DSS, there's a PSD2. There's a lot of these regulations, right? And if you look into a lot of these regulations, they have some commonality, right? So they all talk about a few common things. You need to think about it. It all starts with the risk management, right? Like, what is the risk that you are willing to take, right? So it generally looks in towards the risk, because everything that you're building or you're setting up, there's some risk involved, right? Like, even if you think about the AI regulation, right, it talks about the risks that you're willing to take as an organization when building these models, because some of these models might be decisions for people that you are not necessarily seeing, right? And then you're impacting their life. So basically, what is the risk that you're willing to take as an organization when you're building things? So it starts with that, right? So, and I like my CRO who always says that everybody is a risk manager, right? You need to start thinking of it as a risk manager would, right? Like, every change that you bring in towards, let's say you're making a software change, it's a risk at the end of the day, right? So when you make a change, you're changing it from an existing working condition to something that may or may not work. So you're introducing new risk. So it starts with thinking about the risk. Then you start looking into all of the things, services that you're providing, and narrow it down, right? Like, you could go to the entire organization, and then you have a huge risk profile. Different risks that's there, and you categorize them. But let's say if it is in software development, you think about, okay, what are the risks that's there in software development? And then you start categorizing these. What are the things that you're willing to take? So this is the first step you need to do, right? Even before you look into regulations, you start thinking about the risks that you're taking when you're building things. So if it was, since we're talking about, AI and we're talking about disruptions, right? Basically, whenever you're building any application, right? So let's say you're building a recommendation system for somebody to pick up a movie, what's the risk that could happen, right? The risk is that
You
company will.
might have a bad evening. You could
Yes,
you could
indeed.
have the bad evening and see just the movie you don't like. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So the risk is very little, and you can say, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to build. But let's say you're building a fraud system, right? So you're looking into all of the transactions, and you're building actually a engine which is seeing whether the transaction that happened is it fraudulent or not. Now the risk here is very different, because if you flag it as fraudulent, you're basically stopping a transaction from happening. And if this was not a fraud transaction, then you're actually blocking somebody with a very valid purpose to do something, right? So then now your risk profile is
Exactly.
very different, right? Now you need to think about, okay, now when I'm making these changes in the system, I could basically increase the false positives, right? Or it could also entirely lose out, and then we could not be at all looking into the fraud cases and ignoring all of the fraud cases, eventually losing a lot of money, right? So now your risk for actually bringing the software changes significantly. Then you decide what is the risk that you're willing to take whenever you're building this, right? Like when I'm building a software, I'm going to think about, okay, this change that I do, if I don't test it, I will not
Mhm.
know what's going to happen. I'll say it's okay. I can take with the recommendation engine of a movie. I would say, you know what? That's a risk I'm willing to take. I'm not going to test it. At the end,
Exactly.
somebody's not going to like. But on a fraud system, I would say no. I definitely want to make test. I want to put in a lot of patterns to see whether the change that I've made is actually still continuing the same thing. So here I'm not willing to take the risk. So it starts from thinking about the risk, right? Then you start bringing the regulations. And the regulations, a lot of them will be talking about how do you handle this risk, right? So if
Okay.
you look into some regulation like DORA, part of it, one of the first parts of it is talks about risk management. How do you look into ICT risk management, right? Who do you grant access to in your systems, things like that, right? So a lot of these regulations talks about very similar pieces.
So, as I understand, those regulations actually could help you to evaluate this risk, right? Because they
Absolutely,
asking the
right?
same quick questions, so they're not there, just they're there on purpose, actually, to
They're on purpose, and
make.
I think it's
Yeah.
really good to correlate what we do with this whole RFCs, right? Like when you think about like HTTP, right? We're building HTTP
Mhm.
protocol, which is brilliant, right? There was HTTP 1, then there was HTTP 2, and I believe that we are building the HTTP 3 protocol. But each of these protocols gives you a guidance on how to implement a HTTP server and how to implement a HTTP client. Now, you could actually say, I'm going to build everything about the HTTP2 protocol as a server because I want to take all the clients possible. Or you could say, no, I'm going to take a subset because I know the clients that are accessing is only taking into a subset. So I will only fulfill this. So you can think of it as similarity to what's the risk profile that you're taking when you're implementing a regulation. You could say, I mean, some places you will need to definitely implement everything, right? Some places
Yeah.
you can choose. You can also say, okay, this is a risk I'm willing to take and I will classify this. And then you say, I'm not going to implement X, right? While I will implement something else. And that would be the
Exactly.
thing. And that's how you can actually go faster, right? But it starts, of course, understanding your risk profile.
Okay, so what advice would you give to your fellow colleagues, like engineering managers of their larger organizations, or companies who are thinking about going into, for example, financial area, and they are not aware of those regulations and so on? So, uh, what advice would you give to to the fellow CTOs and engineering managers up there?
Indeed, right. I mean, if you're coming from a background where you don't have like this, like financial background, or there's nobody in your organization who understands this, get somebody from outside. Honestly, like this journey, when we started Solaris, right, like we were a very different organization to where we are right now. Now we are a very different organization with people who understand risk, with people who understand banking, right? Like it's changed significantly. And if I look into the journey, that would be the advice, right? Get the people who understand this very well, because this is like
Okay.
your domain experts who understand this knowledge, right? Like, because as technical people, we can tell how to build software. This has always been there,
Exactly.
right? but you need to know how do you look at it in terms of risk, right? How do you look at it in terms of implementing these regulations, right? Like, so my advice would be, if there's nobody in your company, get support from outside. It's always good, right? So that you at least start with that. The second thing is read, right? Honestly, read it looks a lot, right? A lot of these regulations, it seems like crazy to read a regulation, but half of the regulation is, preambles, like it's talking about how the regulation is formed. Just throw that part of it. There's a part of it which is the actual part which talks about implementing things, right? This is actually quite straightforward. If you start reading it, they're quite agnostic, very high level, right? Because then you have your own implementation, right? So I would say, don't shy away from reading, right? Read the
Just invest, like do your homework, right? You need to
do your
do this. You
homework,
need to go
exactly.
to, yeah.
Go through the documents, and you will see that it's not too bad. Usually, most and this is the thing, right? Like most of the regulations talk about common sense, because they would have had to come to this stage, right? Because a lot of people are doing some crazy things, and they said, okay, you know what? Let's put a baseline here so that people don't make the same mistakes over and over again. So if you look into it and read into it, you'll see, this is standard. Like, think about something like ISO standard, which talks about, okay, how do you actually think about physical security in a building, right?
Exactly.
If you're thinking about financial security, then you want to make sure that your building is protected, right? You don't want somebody just walking inside and tapping something into your Wi-Fi router and then getting access to your entire
Exactly.
local network, right? So things like that, right? So read, right?
Okay.
Read and get support.
Great. So we have 2 minutes left, and I have one more question. What's your personal take on their regulations, especially related to AI, in terms of our regulations are stopping the innovations, or helping us to do the safe implementations? What's your take?
I mean, I think so. I first I will think of it as an user, right? Like, and I feel like we should have regulation, but hear me out, and I'll tell you exactly how, with a caveat, right? Because as a user, I would not want my data to be maliciously used, or not malicious. Maybe people don't have malicious things in mind, but fraudulently used, right? I would rather that when I go to, I don't know, when I'm doing a card transaction, suddenly because of some AI machine, my card is not working, and I would like to know why this was not working, right? Like, thinking of it as a user. Now, and I think it matters with the size of the company, and this is where we will be able to breed innovation. For really large companies, I think it needs to be highly regulated. While smaller companies, you want to be lower regulated, because then you're building a lot of innovation in these small companies, because they don't have the resources
And you can move
to
fast
set up a
and so on,
team,
right? Okay.
right?
And you can move fast, like
And you can
without
move
any
fast.
additional. Exactly.
Exactly. Smaller teams, and I think the DORA regulation does a good job, right? Like, so there's it based on the revenue. They basically, on the size of the company, they say, okay, you have a simplified framework. On larger companies, they say, okay, you need to now implement the full framework, right? So I think this is this is a nice approach, right? Look at the size of the company. If they're starting, don't keep it too regulated, because then you stifle innovation. But something like Google, I'm sure we need to make sure that they are regulated quite a lot, right?
That's true. Sat, thank you so much for the conversation. We have some inspiration for other teams out there, and we are finishing and wrapping up the session. So thank you so much, and see you later. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. It was lovely. Ciao.